have any forced religion at home. I had a great deal at school. You had to both study it in class, search the scriptures it was called when I was little, and you had to go to a chapel or church every day at school, at least once. And I was at boarding school, so there was very little escape from that. And I went first to a Church of England little boys prep school, boarding school when I was 8, and then to a Methodist boarding school in Cambridge when I was 13. So I actually had quite a lot of religious variety in my life in the formative years.
And did you believe any of it?
No, you don't become an atheist so much as you find out that's what you are. There's no moment of sort of conversion. You don't suddenly think, I don't believe this anymore. You essentially find you don't believe it. And in my case, that happened when I was about, I don't know, 9 or 10, I think.
Wouldn't it be nice to believe that there was somebody up there looking after you, Christopher?
No, which is why I say, in fact, very deliberately, that I'm not an atheist, I'm anti-theist. In other words, I'm not just one who's concluded that it's not true, or rather that there's absolutely no evidence to think that it is true, which is the furthest you can really go. But that I'm glad there's no evidence for it, because if it were to be true, one would be living under a permanent surveillance, the round-the-clock celestial dictatorship that watched you while you slept and could convict you of thought crime, could indict you for things you thought in the privacy of your own skull, and sentence you to quite a long stretch, namely eternity, of punishment for that, or dangle a not to me very attractive reward of a life of eternal praise and groveling and sprawling and singing the praises of someone who you were ordered to love, someone who you must both love and fear. That used to distress me when I was little as well. How are you supposed to love someone who you're so afraid of?
Do you feel contemptuous of religion?
Yes, that's exactly the word I would use.
Do you feel contemptuous of people who are religious?
In most cases, yes, I do. Yeah, I mean, if somebody says to me, well, I'll pray for you, I instantly lose some respect for them. I try not to show it, but I immediately lose some respect. One reason why I think religion is a great subject is that it's our first attempt from our childhood, from our infancy, at doing philosophy, for example, at doing, indeed, science, and even history. It's the worst because it's the first, but it still was the first, so one has to have a position on it, and therefore arguing all night with someone about Aquinas is not to me a waste of time.
What is it particularly about Islam that you find so disturbing?
Well, because it claims to be the last and final. The Muslim world can know no peace until everyone has become a Muslim. And that's a very permissible reading of the Quran as well, and of the Hadith. And there are many, many Muslim scholars who say, yes, that's right. Ultimately, everyone should be a Muslim. Well, I don't like being talked to in that tone of voice, and I do not believe that the Archangel Gabriel, the same one who announces her pregnancy to Mary, appears to an illiterate merchant in Arabia that we have, without any alteration, the exact words that were dictated. I don't believe that for a second.
Let's talk about whether you can be a moral person without believing in God.
Well, I think that the answer to that is and must be yes. I think our morality is innate to us. The likelihood is that religion took its morals from ordinary human morality rather than the other way around. How could I demonstrate that? Well, for example, I mean, animals show social solidarity. They stick up for each other, they look out for each other, they stick up for one another. They have a certain amount of code. Now, we know no one says they get that from God. We're an animal species, we're primates. We have that innate in us. We wouldn't have got this far if we didn't. But we're the only ones who think so highly of ourselves that we think, well, we must have got it from something divine. In fact, it's part of being a primate. We shouldn't give ourselves such airs. Someone asked me the other day, do you think your daughter is a primate too, or an animal? And I said, well, her father certainly is one. That I can. Of that I can assure you. And if you knew him better, you wouldn't doubt it either. So I doubt that Antonio isn't an animal. Of course, it is somehow hard for me to say, well, there goes another primate, rather than there goes my heart running around in someone else's little body. But I'm not going to fool myself or fool others. I think there's no prize to be won in romanticizing these things.
Well, tell me a little bit about your upbringing, your religious upbringing.
Well, both my parents were in different ways religious refugees, you could almost say. My father had been brought up in a very strict Calvinist Baptist household by a really tyrannical grandfather, who I remember, his father, my paternal grandfather, who was a teacher in a very rough part of Portsmouth. And I think not just Sundays were pretty grim in that family, but probably every day was pretty grim. Fiction was considered immoral to read a novel, no music, nothing like this. And a very grim old guy. Then my father went off to join the Navy. I don't think he actually ran away to sea, but I think it was obvious to me he decided not to do this to his children. And my mother was a refugee of a different kind in that she's of Jewish origin. Her ancestors came to England from what is now Poland, but was then Germany, that rather rough bit of the border, the Silesian border. And she wanted to pass. She could pass. Didn't look Jewish, as they say. My grandmother did, my mother's mother, but she didn't. And she didn't want my brother or myself to be thought of as Jewish. She wanted us to be English gentlemen. So you be the judge of how well that worked out. And I didn't indeed find out this about her and that element of her background until I was in my 30s and after she died. But that's another story altogether. However, in England you are made to have compulsory religion at school. Sorry, made to have compulsory as tautology, but religion has to be taught in school, and it has to be taught as truth as well. It's not taught comparatively. So though I didn't have any forced religion at home, I had a great deal at school. You had to both study it in class, search the scriptures it was called when I was little, and you had to go to a chapel or church every day at school, at least once. And I was at boarding school, so there was very little escape from that. And I went first to a Church of England little boys prep school, boarding school when I was 8, and then to a Methodist boarding school in Cambridge when I was 13. So I actually had quite a lot of religious variety in my life in the formative years.
And did you believe any of it?
No, I'm one of those who is, Pascal puts it like this when the people he's addressing, when he writes his pensées, he writes them to the one who is so made that he cannot believe. In other words, he knew what a lot of people don't understand, which is that there are, and there always have been, a percentage, we think it might be as high as 10, 11% of people who just can't bring themselves to, because aren't made in such a way as to be able to. So you don't become an atheist so much as you find out that's what you are. There's no moment of sort of conversion. You suddenly think, I don't believe this anymore. You essentially find you don't believe it. And in my case, that happened when I was about, I don't know, 9 or 10, I think.
And did you tell your parents? Did you say anything to anybody?
No, I didn't. And at the time, I felt it made me rather eccentric, because as far as I knew, everyone in the world thought this was okay, thought that it was true about the Bible stories. And realizing that I didn't think it could possibly be, nor the implication that there was a creator, which was taught us not just in divinity class, but by the woman who taught us about nature, which had supposedly some authority. I thought, I don't believe that either. It took me a while till I started to meet other boys who come to the same conclusion.
And when you say you didn't believe, what is it that you didn't believe? You didn't believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and you didn't believe in God either?
I didn't believe that there was a creator to begin with. That was the first. I'll tell you the story if you like. It's in my book, but I can shorten it. Mrs. Watts, lovely old lady, childless widow, taught us nature, trees, plants, birds, all that kind of thing. She also taught us scripture. And one day she tried to fuse these two roles by saying, children, you notice how lovely and green all the vegetation is. This was on Dartmoor, a lovely part of Devon, lovely part of England. How beautiful and green everything is, and that shows how nice and kind God is, because green happens to be the colour that's most restful to our eyes. And he could have made it purple or magenta or something really nasty, and that would have been very clashing and glaring. And I remember thinking, that's nonsense. I didn't know anything about chlorophyll or photosynthesis, or the evolution of the eye, or natural selection, or genes, or anything of the sort. But I knew, as if I knew, not a bit better than by instinct, that's wrong. It must be the other way around. The eyes have adapted to the vegetation, surely, not the vegetation to the eye.
And what about your Jewish heritage? That was something you learned recently, wasn't it?
Yes, it was when my grandmother, my mother's mother, outlived my mother by many years and was about to outlive my father, who was dying. And around that point, my brother also took the decision to get married to a young Jewish woman. So my grandmother decided there was no further need to keep the secret that my mother had not wanted broken. And she told my brother and myself that we had Jewish ancestry. It was a rather amazing thing to find at the point when I was dealing with the impending death of my father. I sort of turned over a lot of my luggage, but I found it was actually, for me, a pleasant discovery. I was pleased to find it. And it made me write the only autobiographical essay I've ever written, about sort of looking into my roots a bit. And that I don't want to repudiate, because I don't like the idea that my mother felt she had to deny. So I'm not going to practice denial. In other words, if somebody says to me, "Are you Jewish?" in whatever tone of voice, whether it's a friendly or unfriendly question, I would feel I had to say yes. Then there are various qualifications. You know, I don't practice. I don't believe in the covenant. I don't think I'm chosen. I'm not a Zionist. Or things like that. But I have a respect for the Jewish tradition.
So you like the cultural part of it and the continuity of the tradition?
Well, the Seder, for one thing, is also Hellenistic. I mean, the idea of the Seder is that you lie around, should be on couches, not on chairs. You drink wine, you ask questions and give answers, and you try and draw in the brighter young people into the conversation. It's modeled on a Platonic symposium. There's a lot of Hellenism in Judaism, and I wish it predominated myself.
I'm talking about actually using the word, the A word, because it's a very harsh word. Some people have said, if you call yourself an atheist, it's like saying you're a child molester.
Well, it certainly wasn't true in the England in which I was brought up. I mean, after all, this is the Cambridge of Charles Darwin. In fact, there were boys in the school called things like Darwin and Huxley and so forth, and Keynes as well. This is where the atom was split. This is where the double helix was discovered. This was a place where, not being religious, you know, was a very small thing. This was a place where Bertrand Russell had been teaching in living memory. So that was easy. I've never found it that difficult, by the way, in America either to say I'm an atheist, not on the level of child molestation. So there was nothing to overcome in that respect. The only thing one had to discover was whether one was an atheist or an agnostic. That's what we used to ask ourselves.
And
that word also coming from another Huxley, Thomas Huxley, who coined it during the debate over evolution. It's a very new word, theoretically a middle position. Some people don't like atheist for another reason, which is all it does is to say what you don't believe. It isn't very positive. It's a negative affirmation, if you like. I don't mind that either. I think it's a perfectly good question to be asked, and I think one's answer should be honest. If you say you don't believe, which is what an agnostic has to say, because an agnostic says, I can't decide it, well, it means you don't believe in God. Otherwise you would have decided. Well, if you don't believe, you're an atheist. QED.
And so you call yourself an atheist now?
Because to be a believer, you have to be not just, in my view, a deist. In other words, someone who believes that there is a God. That all your work is still ahead of you as a religious person, if you believe that. To be a religious person, in other words, a theist, you have to say that you think that God intervenes, cares about you, has a plan for you, takes an interest in human affairs, and can, in fact, be solicited to intervene. I mean, can answer prayers, can perform miracles, and so that you have to believe that. Now, I frankly don't think anyone really believes that. They would like to believe it. I wouldn't like to. I don't think it'd be a nice idea if it was true, but that's a different question.
Why wouldn't you like to believe it? Wouldn't it be nice to believe that there was somebody up there looking after you, Christopher?
No, which is why I say, in fact, very deliberately, that I'm not an atheist, I'm an anti-theist. In other words, I'm not just one who's concluded that it's not true, or rather that there's absolutely no evidence to think that it is true, which is the furthest you can really go. But that I'm glad there's no evidence for it, because if it were to be true, one would be living under a permanent surveillance, around-the-clock celestial dictatorship that watched you while you slept and could convict you of thought crime, could indict you for things you thought in the privacy of your own skull, and sentence you to quite a long stretch, namely eternity, of punishment for that, or dangle a not to me very attractive reward of a life of eternal praise and groveling and sprawling and singing the praises of someone who you were ordered to love, someone who you must both love and fear. That used to distress me when I was little as well. How are you supposed to love someone who you're so afraid of? Compulsory love? How fascinating. I didn't know about sadomasochism then. Though actually there was quite a lot of it in some of the boarding schools I was at, but that was for later. But I think there's something essentially sadomasochistic about the religious universe, especially the Christian one.
Well, suppose somebody said there was a loving God who was looking after you, who was not going to punish you for anything, who was not going to blame you for anything, who was simply going to love you and take care of you and look after you. Unlike so many of the Christian religions where you are sinners and you have to be saved.
If it was all win-win-win.
It's all win-win, yeah.
No one ever has offered me that, but I would still be very dubious about it because I think dictatorship is in some ways made worse when it's benign, when it's all for your own good. I mean, I find that, in a way, the most unattractive form of despotism.
Do you feel contemptuous of religion?
Yes, that's exactly the word I would use.
Do you feel contemptuous of people who are religious?
In most cases, yes, I do. Yeah, I mean, if somebody says to me, well, I'll pray for you, I instantly lose some respect for them. I try not to show it, but I immediately lose some respect. And if they say they've been praying that, I don't know, their business turns around, or their children get into Harvard or something of this sort, I certainly feel contempt for that.
And yet you have so many friends who are religious.
Not many of them in that way.
I know we have mutual friends who are religious who would in fact say, I will pray for you, and who I know you like and respect. How do you deal with that aspect of their belief or their faith?
Well, the proposal I make in my little book is, that's fine by me. I would say what Mr. Jefferson said. I don't mind if my neighbor believes in one God or in 100 gods. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. And that ought to be true. And in the United States, actually, to an amazing extent, is true. That they leave me alone and I'll leave them alone. It's coexistence, just as they don't quarrel any longer, as between Congregationalists and Baptists, or between Adventists and Mormons. Very little of that. But, however, in the last instance, the religious person cannot keep to a promise to leave me out of it, because he wouldn't be true to himself or herself if said, I'm not going to bother you with what I think, because that's watching me go to hell. And how can a friend do that? In their origins, at least, religions were all mandates for their adherents. You have to go out and win people for this faith. You can't let them just sit there. It would be a sin. You'd be a sinner yourself if you didn't try and save Hitchens.
So what do you believe about the world, about how we got here, about what the meaning of life is?
Oh, I'm fairly conventional as to how we got here. I mean, I think that what was originally initially insultingly called the Big Bang was called the Big Bang by Fred Hoyle in an attempt to discredit it, now accepted as the origin of the cosmos, and it's moving away from us at rather a rapid rate, and it's one day going to flame out. Probably not in our lifetimes, but could be. And then we now know, thanks to the unraveling of the human genome, an enormous amount about how we come to be here, what we have in common, not just with other animal species, but with plants as well. In other words, that we are part of nature, we're not a separate creation from it. That's all had a very humanizing effect, I think. It's done away more or less with racism. It's done away with creationism. Various superstitions are falling away. It's also very beautiful to study the double helix. If you want some awe in your life and something transcendent and numinous, because I think everyone wants the transcendent and the numinous. I just think they shouldn't confuse it with the supernatural. If you take a look through the Hubble telescope, or at the intricacies of the double helix, that's enormously more beautiful and awe-inspiring than the burning bush, for example.
A lot of people will talk about atheists as being angry, and that people who are sort of militant atheists are really angry people, and people who are seeking something themselves, otherwise they wouldn't care so much.
Limitlessly curious, yes, and proud of it. And at a time when there's so much to know, I mean, so much to be reading and finding out about in the natural and scientific world. For someone like myself as a non-scientist, and then angry, impatient certainly, fed up of being told, well, faith should be respected. Why should it be? So, well, you may not believe you should respect somebody's faith. I don't see why I have to. Romney thinks that the Battle of Cumorah took place in upstate New York in the legendary past, shifting biblical scenes to North America, and the handsome light-skinned ones won, and the dark, horrible ones were condemned forever afterwards to be African American, and weren't admitted to his church till 1979. If he wants to believe that, he can. He cannot make me respect it. I've just written a column saying I think it's detestable that he was ever a member of such a church. He was an adult member of a racist organization. He owes us an explanation. Instead of which he says, don't ask, that would be attacking me for my faith. No. See, I can get angry. That pisses me off, actually. One reason why I think religion is a great subject is that it's our first attempt from our childhood, from our infancy, at doing philosophy, for example. It's at doing, indeed, the science and even history. It's what we came up with when we didn't know very much about the natural order. We didn't know where we came from. We thought the Earth was about 6,000 years old. We didn't know it was round. We didn't know there were microorganisms that actually had dominion over us rather than we over them. We didn't know where earthquakes came from. All of this, it's the worst because it's the first, but it still was the first. So one has to have a position on it, and therefore arguing all night with someone about Aquinas is not, to me, a waste of time. It's very interesting and good training.
What is it that has driven you to learn so much about religion? What is it about it that fascinates you so much?
Well, I studied philosophy when I was at Oxford, and in a way, the first efforts at philosophy are made by the schoolmen, if you like, by people who were in holy orders. I mean, partly no one else was allowed to practice it after the Christian Empire closed the schools of philosophy in Greece, after Justinian made Christianity the official religion of the empire. But after that happened, philosophy was a branch of religion. So you have to study Peter Abelard if you want to know how Aristotle came back into the West, via Baghdad, by the way. You have to study my favorite medieval philosopher, William of Ockham, the man who coined the phrase Occam's razor, the method of logical disputation. And being religiously literate, let's say, is part of being educated.
Where do you stand on the argument that schools should be required to teach religion to their students?
I think I'm in favor. I mean, if they don't, then you'd be in the position I'm now in. What my children know about religion is from me. I try and tell them, and I take them to religious events. So this is what the Catholic ceremony is like, this is what a Jewish one is like, and so forth. But it seems odd that I'm doing that, and they didn't used to know what I thought about these things, but they know now. So it's rather weird to have Daddy doing the instructing. And I think schools ought to make people religiously literate. People ought to know that Augustine wrote The City of God. People ought to know about the disputes that have been between Occam and others, and so forth. It's a great way of teaching people. I also think, in a funny way, it's worth teaching the argument, as President Bush rather shadily calls it, between the creationists and the evolutionists. Not in science class, because there's no argument among scientists about it, but it's part of our cultural history. The Scopes trial should be taught. I learned about the debate between Darwin and the anti-Darwinians because of the public debate between Huxley and Bishop Wilberforce at Oxford in the 19th century. That's how I learned, by studying the argument. So I think all that should be taught. Otherwise we're going to have the awful concept that there are areas that are off limits to American children, because otherwise it would be too controversial. That's the death of education.
Do you see any good in religion?
Yes. There are two kinds. There's the practical kind. Daniel Dennett is very good on this in his book, Breaking the Spell. Obviously, among our ancestors, those who went to the witch doctor event believing in it had a slightly better chance of being cured than those who didn't believe or didn't go. Marginal and fraudulent, but everybody knows that morale is an ingredient in recovery, and probably just being at the ceremony made some people feel better, helped to glue them together in the dark, which was full of demons as far as they knew, as far as they were told. So it probably helped people to get through the Dark Ages, which it also did darken, I have to say. And then there's what I call, I don't call it, but what is known as the apotropaic. In other words, if I say something risky, as I once did in print, well, none of my children have ever had any physical difficulty, they've never been ill. I think, God, I shouldn't have said that. You get superstitious. I admit it. And you want to ward off any claim that's hubristic. You don't want to take any credit. You feel a natural wish to set the credit elsewhere. It's a bit too much like spitting when you cross water or touching wood, so forth. But it also has a sort of modesty about it. It's what the Greeks would call avoidance of hubris.
You've been very critical of Islam. What is it particularly about Islam that you find so disturbing?
Well, because it claims to be the last and final of the three monotheisms, to be the completion of everything. I mean, the way I put that is it's a plagiarism of its predecessors, largely, as is its holy book, supposedly holy book. It's a plagiarism from Judaism and Christianity, and not a very elegant one. But it says, rather than say we're indebted, it says, no, that's it. You don't need any more. There's no further need for any more books, any more revelations, any more prophets. All you need to recognize is that there's one God and Muhammad is his messenger. That's implicitly very worrying, I think, because it's an absolutist claim, latently totalitarian, as all religious claims are.
I wonder.
From that comes the idea, which is debated, of course, among Muslims as to what the precise meaning of the word jihad is, but there is no doubt that one of its meanings is that the Muslim world can know no peace until everyone has become a Muslim. That's a very permissible reading of the Quran as well, and of the Hadith. There are many Muslim scholars who say, yes, that's right. Ultimately, everyone should be Muslim. Well, I don't like being talked to in that tone of voice, and I do not believe that the Archangel Gabriel, the same one who announces her pregnancy to Mary, appears to an illiterate merchant in Arabia that we have, without any alteration, the exact words that were dictated. I don't believe that for a second.
Do you think that Islam is a violent religion?
Well, as I say, it has this, because of the immense claims it makes for itself, and the tremendous reluctance it has to undergo any form of self-criticism. You hear people saying, what about it having a reformation? That may be phrasing it wrongly. Just to have a self-criticism, for example, very few Jewish or Christian scholars will now say the Bible is the unalterable Word of God. There are many arguments about the authorship of different books and texts, the multiple authorship, the layerings, the interpolations, and so forth. It's admitted by Talmudic and biblical scholars. There's an orthodox fringe and a fundamentalist fringe in both cases that repudiates this, denies it, but it's more or less mainstream now that it's a textual matter. With Islam, that's completely refused. No, the Quran is not a subject for textual analysis at all. What are you talking about? It's the unalterable Word of God. You can't even use it for literary purposes, Mr. Rushdie, without running a very severe risk. And please let us remind you and underline what that risk would be. Yes, I think it's violent.
Aren't you scared? Have you been threatened yourself?
Well, I'm not an apostate, as Salman was. I was never a Muslim, in other words. The penalty, it's not in the Quran, it is in the Hadith. The penalty for abandoning your Muslim faith is indeed death. But that doesn't apply to me. I dwell in jahiliyyah, in ignorance, in darkness. I don't know any better. There's been a slight change in this lately, though. A sinister one, too. They've started attacking non-Muslims and threatening them, as in Denmark. So it used to be you had to be an apostate. Now you can be just anybody. And that's a line that shouldn't have been crossed without people noticing it. Yes, I was threatened once by Iran. At least so the State Department Office of Counterterrorism told me. This was after I'd helped arrange a visit for Mr. Rushdie to Washington in the early days of the Clinton administration. Successful visit. And they called me in and said they'd picked up a believable threat to me from Iran, but nothing materialized.
Let's talk about whether you can be a moral person without believing in God.
Well, I think that the answer to that is and must be yes. I think our morality is innate to us. The likelihood is that religion took its morals from ordinary human morality rather than the other way around. How could I demonstrate that? Well, for example, I mean, animals show social solidarity. They stick up for each other, they look out for each other, they stick up for one another. They have a certain amount of code. Now, we know no one says they get that from God. We're an animal species, we're primates. We have that innate in us. We wouldn't have got this far if we didn't. But we're the only ones who think so highly of ourselves that we think, well, we must have got it from something divine. In fact, it's part of being a primate. We shouldn't give ourselves such airs. Even the stories that inculcate it in religion prove this in a way. I mean, it cannot be, can it, that the children of Israel, containing, if the story is true, some of my ancestors, but of course the story isn't true about the wanderings into Sinai, but suppose it to be true, they get all the way to Sinai and then they're told, hey, murder, perjury, theft, don't do it. Are we supposed to think that they were under the impression that was okay till they got that far? Because I don't think, A, that they did, or B, that if they had thought that was okay, they would have got that far. The species couldn't have evolved. Then that's from the Old Testament. From the New, take the story of the Good Samaritan. All we know about the Good Samaritan was he was not a Christian, because it's Jesus telling the story about this guy. So if he existed, it was before Christianity was preached. Actually, none of the disciples could have been Christians because they hadn't read the New Testament. Let that go. He just knows what to do when he sees a fellow creature in trouble on the Jericho Road. And if you remember, the only people who leave the guy weltering in his own blood and neglected and duffed up and far from home are the priests and the Levites, or the holy people. They leave it. And there's nothing said about the Samaritan, the man from Samaria, having any religious reason to do what he did.
Where do you get your morality?
And the golden rule is fine for me, which is from Confucius before Rabbi Hillel even formulates it. Most people are born knowing that, or something like it. Children don't have to be taught elementary fairness. They sometimes have to have it reinforced a bit, but they don't have to be introduced to the idea. They know it's there. They know when they've broken it. And when people don't have any feeling for others, we call them sociopathic. They're also presumably children of God. I don't know how the faithful explain that. And when they take a positive pleasure in maltreating others, we call them psychopathic. There are quite a lot of those too. You
talked about this question that you ask that no one has been able to answer so far.
Well, yes, actually it takes the form of two questions, but the main one is, to those who say, what about it? Don't we get how we know right from wrong? How we know how to perform a right action or say a right thing without divine permission or divine spark? You have to name a moral action performed or a moral statement made by somebody who's a believer that couldn't have been made by a non-believer or uttered by them. I've tried this now in debate with some quite senior theologians of various schools of Christianity and Judaism and Islam. I've put it in print, I've done it on the air. I haven't yet had a single reply.
No takers.
Well, somebody said, what about an exorcism? And I said, no, I don't think, no. That wouldn't count. Weird thought. And then the second question is, name me a wicked action committed or a wicked statement made by someone because of their faith, done because they were religious. No one has any difficulty thinking of one. Everyone in the audience has thought of one before we finished speaking. Female circumcision community, male circumcision community, genital mutilation community, almost exclusively religious. Suicide murder community, almost entirely religious. End of the world is coming. We can't wait for the complete destruction of humanity. That'll be a great day when the species is wiped out. Completely religious. This wickedness. Preaching of hell, lying to children, completely religious. Things that a secular person wouldn't dream of doing, conscience would stop them from doing that.
Christopher, a lot of people will look at someone who claims to be an atheist and say, well, how could they be a good person? What are their feelings? What are their needs? How do they find meaning in their lives? I heard you say once, you look at your daughter and you see your heart walking around in another person's body.
Yes, you remember that, yeah.
What for you is a sense of the divine?
Someone asked me the other day, do you think your daughter is a primate too, or an animal? And I said, well, her father certainly is one. That I can, of that I can assure you. And if you knew him better, you wouldn't doubt it either. So I doubt that Antonio isn't an animal. Of course, it is somehow hard for me to say, well, there goes another primate, rather than there goes my heart running around in someone else's little body. But I'm not going to fool myself or fool others. I think there's no prize to be won in romanticizing these things. When you asked me earlier about did religion do any good, this should be part of my answer. I mean, there's no doubt that religion has inspired people to create extraordinary music and architecture. I don't think so highly of devotional painting. And by the way, I think some of those painters were hypocrites. They just had to do devotional scenes to get the job. But there is no secular equivalent to Durham Cathedral that I can think of. Not even the Chrysler Building.
But you were talking earlier about...
So I look for the divine and the transcendent.
The divine and the numinous, the transcendent. Where do you find that?
I find the numinous and the transcendent I have a need for in literature and music and poetry, in my case. One hopes for love, but I think it has to stop short of the supernatural. People may sometimes get the feeling that they are as gods, and okay, that's about enough transcendence. That's as far as you can go. And at that point, that's maybe a pleasurable one. It's a delusion.